The moment Victoria steps out of the black Rolls-Royce in elegant yellow, holding hands with three adorable boys in matching outfits, while Marcus and Isabella stand frozen in shock at their own wedding ceremony, photographers capturing every second. The rain hammered against the windows of the mansion like angry fists, matching the storm brewing inside. Victoria sat on the edge of their king-sized bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the tissue box that had become her constant companion these past months. The silence between them had grown so thick you could cut it with a knife. Marcus paced the marble floor of their bedroom, his expensive shoes clicking with each agitated step. His shadow danced across the walls as lightning illuminated the room, making him look like a stranger she no longer recognized. The man she had fallen in love with, the one who had promised her forever, was nowhere to be found. 5 years, Victoria. He finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment and frustration. 5 years of marriage, and still nothing to show for it. Victoria's heart clenched. She had heard this conversation building for weeks, maybe months, but nothing could have prepared her for the coldness in his tone. "Marcus, please. We can keep trying. The doctor said there are still options." "Options?" Marcus spun around, his eyes blazing with an emotion that terrified her. "I'm tired of options. I'm tired of hope. I'm tired of making excuses to my family, my friends, my business partners when they ask about children." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Each syllable was carefully chosen to wound, to break down the last fragments of her already shattered confidence. She had given everything to this marriage, her career, her dreams, her identity. She had molded herself into the perfect wife, attending every business dinner, hosting every social gathering, supporting every decision he made. "I never asked you to make excuses for me," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I've been trying just as hard as you have. This isn't something I can control." Marcus's laugh was bitter and cruel. "Can't you? Maybe you're not trying hard enough. Maybe you're too focused on that little bakery project of yours instead of focusing on what really matters, giving me an heir." Victoria's bakery wasn't just a project. It was her lifeline, the one thing that gave her purpose when the monthly disappointments became too heavy to bear. She had built it from nothing, working 16-hour days to create something beautiful in a life that felt increasingly empty. "My bakery helps people, Marcus. It brings joy." "Joy doesn't continue the family name," Marcus cut her off, his voice rising. "Joy doesn't carry on my legacy. I need a wife who can give me children, not someone who plays with flour all day." The cruelty in his words took Victoria's breath away. This was the man who had once told her that her passion for baking was one of the things he loved most about her. The man who had eaten her experimental recipes and declared each one better than the last. That man seemed like a distant memory now. "I've made my decision," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone with theatrical precision. "I'm calling my lawyer tomorrow. This marriage is over." Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her. "Marcus, no. Please don't do this. We took vows, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. This is just a rough patch. We can work through this together." "Together?" Marcus's voice dripped with disdain. "There is no together anymore, Victoria. There's me trying to build something meaningful, and there's you holding me back. My mother was right from the beginning. I should have chosen someone more suitable." The mention of his mother was the final straw. Marcus's mother, Patricia, had never accepted Victoria. She had made it clear from day one that Victoria wasn't good enough for her precious son, that she came from the wrong family, the wrong background. Victoria had spent years trying to win her approval, bending over backwards to prove her worth, only to have it thrown back in her face now when she was most vulnerable. "Your mother never gave me a chance," Victoria said, finding a spark of strength she didn't know she still possessed. "Nothing I ever did was good enough for her, and apparently nothing I do is good enough for you either." "Because it isn't," Marcus replied without hesitation. "A real woman would have given me children by now. A real wife would put her husband's needs above her own silly hobbies." The word silly struck Victoria like a lightning bolt. Her bakery, Sweet Dreams Confectionery, had become the most beloved spot in their neighborhood. People came from across the city to taste her creations. She had built something real, something that mattered to people's lives. But to Marcus, it was just a silly hobby. "I want you out," Marcus continued, his voice now cold and businesslike. "Take whatever you need, but I want you gone by tomorrow evening. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce papers." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Tomorrow? Marcus, this is my home too. We built this life together." "We built nothing together," Marcus interrupted. "I built this life. I bought this house. I pay for everything. You've just been along for the ride." The dismissal in his voice was devastating. Victoria felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller until she felt like she might disappear entirely. Years of love, sacrifice, and devotion reduced to being along for the ride. "Where am I supposed to go?" Victoria asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Marcus shrugged with callous indifference. "That's not my problem anymore. Maybe you can stay above your little bakery. I'm sure there's a storage room or something suitable for your new circumstances." The mockery in his tone was unbearable. Victoria stood up slowly, her legs shaking but her resolve beginning to crystallize. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly. "Good," Marcus replied, already turning away from her. "And Victoria, don't expect any sympathy from our friends. They all know the truth about why this marriage failed." As Victoria began pulling clothes from their shared closet, each item felt like a piece of her life being torn away. The designer dresses Marcus had bought her for business events, the casual outfits for their weekend getaways that now seemed like scenes from someone else's life. She left most of it behind, taking only the clothes that felt truly hers. Marcus had left the room, probably to call his lawyer or his mother to share the good news. Victoria was alone with the echo of his words and the weight of her shattered dreams. But as she packed her small suitcase, something unexpected began to grow in her chest. It wasn't defeat. It was something else entirely. For the first time in years, Victoria began to imagine a life where she didn't have to apologize for who she was, where her worth wasn't measured by someone else's expectations. The storm outside began to calm, and through the clearing clouds, Victoria caught a glimpse of moonlight. It felt like a sign, though of what she couldn't yet say. The small apartment above Sweet Dreams Confectionery felt like a prison cell compared to the sprawling mansion Victoria had called home for 5 years. The walls were thin, the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the heating system made strange noises throughout the night. But it was hers, bought with her own money from the bakery's profits that Marcus had always dismissed as pocket change. Victoria sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the divorce papers that had arrived that morning. The legal language was cold and clinical, reducing years of marriage to property divisions and asset allocations. Marcus was keeping everything: the house, the cars, even the wedding gifts they had received together. According to his lawyer, since Victoria had no children and had contributed minimally to the household income, she was entitled to almost nothing. The cruelest part wasn't the financial devastation, though that was crushing enough. It was the narrative Marcus had crafted, the story he was telling everyone who would listen. Victoria learned about it when Mrs. Henderson, her elderly neighbor, stopped by the bakery with sympathetic eyes and a casserole. "Oh dear," Mrs. Henderson had said, patting Victoria's hand. "I heard from Patricia at the country club. She said you and Marcus are divorcing because you can't have children. What a shame. She mentioned you were unable to fulfill your wifely duties." The words had hit Victoria like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just left her. He had destroyed her reputation in the process. The story spreading through their social circle painted her as defective, broken, a woman who had failed at the most basic level of femininity. Victoria's hands shook as she set the papers aside and walked to the small mirror hanging crooked on the bathroom wall. The reflection staring back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her once bright eyes were surrounded by dark circles. Her cheeks had hollowed out from stress and barely eating. She looked like a shadow of the confident woman who had once hosted dinner parties for Marcus's business associates. The bakery downstairs, once her sanctuary, had become another source of pain. Customers who had been regulars for years now whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Some looked at her with pity, others with judgment. A few had stopped coming altogether, clearly uncomfortable with the scandal surrounding her personal life. "Victoria?" Emma's voice called from downstairs. "Are you up there? The morning rush is starting." Emma, her best friend since college, the one person who had stood by her through everything. Victoria took a deep breath and forced herself to move. She couldn't afford to fall apart completely. The bakery was all she had left. Downstairs, Emma was already handling the early customers with her usual efficiency, but Victoria could see the worry in her eyes. Emma had been working extra hours without pay, trying to keep the business afloat while Victoria struggled to function. "How are you holding up?" Emma asked softly when there was a brief lull between customers. "I'm fine," Victoria lied, tying her apron with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "You're not fine," Emma replied firmly. "You've lost 15 pounds, you barely sleep, and yesterday I found you crying into a batch of cookie dough. This has to stop." "What am I supposed to do?" Victoria's voice cracked. "He took everything. Not just the house or the money. He took my dignity. Do you know what people are saying about me? They're treating me like I'm damaged goods, like I'm less of a woman because I couldn't give him children." Emma moved closer, lowering her voice. "Have you ever thought that maybe the problem wasn't with you?" Victoria looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you ever been tested? Really tested? Or did you just assume that since nothing was happening, it must be your fault?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Victoria realized with startling clarity that she had never been properly evaluated. Marcus had always dismissed the idea, saying it was obviously her issue since men in his family had never had fertility problems. She had accepted his logic because it seemed easier than fighting, because challenging him felt like admitting defeat. "I don't know," Victoria whispered. Marcus said a lot of things," Emma interrupted. "Most of them were designed to make you feel small. Maybe it's time you got some real answers instead of taking his word for everything." That afternoon, when the bakery was closed, Victoria sat in Dr. Harrison's office at Riverside Medical Center, her palms sweating as she waited for test results. The doctor, a kind man with gentle eyes, reviewed her file with the thoroughness Marcus had never bothered with. "Mrs. Peterson," Dr. Harrison said, using her married name, though the divorce wasn't final yet, "I have good news. Your reproductive system is completely healthy. Exceptionally healthy, actually. There's absolutely no reason you couldn't conceive and carry a child to term." Victoria felt the world shift beneath her feet. "Are you sure?" "Completely sure. Your hormone levels are perfect, your cycle is regular, and all your tests came back normal. If there have been fertility issues in your marriage, I would strongly suggest your husband be evaluated as well." The drive back to the bakery passed in a blur. Victoria's mind raced with the implications of what she'd learned. 5 years of blame. 5 years of feeling defective. 5 years of carrying the weight of their childlessness. And it had never been her fault at all. But the revelation brought no relief, only a deeper, more painful realization. Marcus had destroyed their marriage based on an assumption. He had never cared enough about the truth to seek it out, never cared enough about her to consider that he might be wrong. That evening, Victoria called Marcus's number for the first time since she'd moved out. He answered on the third ring, his voice cold and impatient. "What do you want, Victoria? My lawyer told you to go through him for everything." "I went to see a doctor today," Victoria said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Good for you. Maybe you'll finally get the help you need." "I don't need help, Marcus. I'm perfectly healthy, completely fertile. The doctor said there's no reason I couldn't have children." Silence stretched across the phone line. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had changed, become defensive. "That's impossible. The problem has to be with you." "When was the last time you were tested?" Victoria asked, already knowing the answer. "I don't need to be tested. Men in my family have never had fertility problems." "Yes, you've said that, but maybe it's time to prove it instead of just assuming it." Marcus's voice turned ugly. "I'm not listening to this desperate attempt to save a marriage that's already over. You're grasping at straws, Victoria. Accept responsibility for once in your life." "I spent 5 years accepting responsibility for something that wasn't my fault," Victoria replied, feeling something powerful awakening inside her chest. "I'm done with that." Marcus hung up without another word. Victoria stood in her small kitchen, holding the silent phone, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. The fog of self-doubt and shame that had surrounded her was beginning to lift, replaced by a dangerous new understanding. She had been living a lie, accepting blame for a problem that might not even be hers to carry. Marcus had built his entire case for divorce on quicksand. and now that foundation was crumbling. But more than that, Victoria began to see their entire marriage with new eyes. The constant criticism, the way Marcus had systematically undermined her confidence, the way he had isolated her from friends and made her dependent on his approval, none of it had been about love. It had been about control. The woman who climbed the stairs to her small apartment that night was different from the broken soul who had descended them that morning. The truth was a powerful thing, and Victoria was just beginning to understand how much of it she had been denied. Weeks had passed since the devastating phone call with Marcus, but the truth Dr. Harrison had revealed continued to reshape everything Victoria thought she knew about herself. The bakery had become her lifeline, each morning bringing familiar routines that helped silence the chaos in her mind. Mixing dough, decorating cakes, serving customers, these simple acts reminded her that she was capable of creating something beautiful, something that brought joy to others. It was during one of these ordinary mornings that James walked into her life. He appeared at the counter just as Victoria was putting the finishing touches on a wedding cake. The irony wasn't lost on her. Tall, with kind eyes and an easy smile, he wore the casual attire of someone who worked with his hands. There was something immediately different about him, a gentleness that made Victoria's defenses waver without her permission. "I heard you make the best coffee cake in the city," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "My crew is working on a renovation project down the street, and we've been surviving on convenience store coffee for weeks." Victoria managed a small smile, the first real one she'd worn in months. "I think I can do better than convenience store coffee. How many people are we feeding?" 8 hungry construction workers who've been up since dawn," James replied with a chuckle. "Fair warning, they're not easily impressed, but they appreciate good food when they taste it." As Victoria boxed up coffee cakes and filled a thermal container with her signature brew, she found herself genuinely curious about this stranger. "What kind of renovation are you working on?" "The old Morrison building is being converted into affordable family apartments," James explained, leaning against the counter in a way that felt comfortable rather than presumptuous. "It's been empty for years, but someone finally decided to turn it into something the community actually needs." The passion in his voice when he talked about his work was unmistakable. Here was someone who built things up instead of tearing them down, who created homes instead of destroying them. The contrast to Marcus was stark and painful. "That sounds like meaningful work," Victoria said softly. "It is," James agreed. "There's something special about taking something broken and making it whole again, giving it a second chance to be beautiful." The words hit Victoria with unexpected force. She turned away quickly, busying herself with unnecessary tasks to hide the sudden tears threatening to fall. When she turned back, James was watching her with concerned eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to upset you. I have a tendency to get philosophical about construction projects." "You didn't upset me," Victoria assured him, though her voice betrayed her emotions. "It's just been a difficult time." James nodded without pushing for details. "Well, if it helps at all, your coffee cake just became the highlight of our morning. I have a feeling we'll be regular customers." True to his word, James returned the next day, and the day after that. Each visit stretched a little longer, the conversations growing more personal. Victoria learned that he was an architect who had started his own construction company focused on community development. He had never married, dedicating his energy to building homes for families who needed them most. "What about you?" James asked one afternoon when the bakery was quiet. "Have you always been a baker?" Victoria hesitated, unsure how much of her story she was ready to share. "It started as a hobby," she said carefully. "Something I did for joy. But recently it's become everything." "Joy is important," James replied seriously. "Too many people forget that work should feed the soul, not just pay the bills." The simple wisdom in his words made Victoria's chest tighten. Marcus had always dismissed her baking as frivolous, a waste of time that distracted from more important things. But James saw it differently. He saw the value in creating joy. Their friendship developed naturally over the following weeks. James would stop by for his morning coffee and stay to chat about everything from local politics to favorite books. He never pushed, never demanded more than Victoria was willing to give, but his presence became a source of comfort she hadn't realized she was desperately craving. The transformation in Victoria didn't go unnoticed. Emma watched with growing hope as her friend began to smile more genuinely. to stand a little straighter, to engage with customers instead of just serving them mechanically. He's good for you, Emma observed one evening as they cleaned up the bakery together. We're just friends, Victoria protested, but even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. Friends don't look at each other the way you two do, Emma replied with a knowing smile. When was the last time you let yourself be happy, Victoria? Really happy? The question haunted Victoria that night as she lay in her small bed above the bakery. When had she last felt genuine happiness? It certainly hadn't been in the final years with Marcus, when every conversation had felt like walking through a minefield. She had been so focused on avoiding his disappointment that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be herself. The next morning brought an unexpected test of her newfound peace. Marcus appeared at the bakery just as Victoria was opening, his expensive car looking out of place on the quiet street. He strode in wearing his trademark arrogance like armor, his eyes scanning the modest space with barely concealed disdain. So this is what you've been reduced to, Marcus said without preamble, living above a bakery like some kind of servant. Victoria felt her old instincts kick in, the urge to apologize, to explain, to somehow prove her worth. But something had changed. The woman who had spent weeks rebuilding her confidence didn't crumble under his contempt. What do you want, Marcus? She asked calmly, continuing to arrange pastries in the display case. I want to talk about this ridiculous claim that you're fertile, Marcus said, his voice rising. I've been thinking about what you said, and it's impossible. The problem has always been with you. Have you been tested yet? Victoria asked, meeting his eyes directly. Marcus's jaw tightened. I don't need to be tested. I'm getting married again, and Isabella is already talking about starting a family. We won't have the problems you and I had. The mention of Isabella, his new fiancée, should have hurt. Instead, Victoria felt an unexpected wave of pity for the woman who was about to discover what life with Marcus really entailed. I hope she makes you happy, Victoria said sincerely. Marcus seemed thrown by her calm response. He had clearly come expecting tears, begging, some kind of emotional reaction he could use to reinforce his narrative about their failed marriage. Victoria's composed dignity left him grasping for weapons that were no longer effective. You'll see, Marcus said finally, his voice lacking its usual conviction. When Isabella gives me children, everyone will know the truth about why our marriage really failed. After he left, Victoria stood quietly in her bakery, surrounded by the sweet scents of vanilla and cinnamon, and realized something profound had just happened. Marcus no longer had the power to break her. His words, once capable of devastating her self-worth, now bounced harmlessly off the armor of self-knowledge she had spent weeks building. That afternoon, James arrived to find Victoria humming as she worked. The sight made him pause in the doorway, struck by the radiance that seemed to emanate from her very being. You seem happy today, he observed, settling into what had become his usual seat at the counter. I am, Victoria replied, surprised by the truth of it. For the first time in years, I actually am. The months that followed Marcus's confrontational visit transformed Victoria's world in ways she never could have imagined. James had become more than a daily customer. He had become her anchor, her safe harbor in a storm that had nearly destroyed her. Their friendship had blossomed into something deeper, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the toxic foundation of control and criticism that had defined her marriage. The evening James proposed was nothing like the elaborate spectacle Marcus had orchestrated years earlier. There were no photographers, no expensive restaurant, no audience to witness his grand gesture. Instead, James had simply appeared at the bakery after closing time with a small velvet box and words that came straight from his heart. Victoria, he had said, taking her flour-dusted hands in his, you've taught me that broken things can become more beautiful than they ever were before. Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that to you? Their wedding was intimate and genuine, held in the small garden behind Sweet Dreams Confectionery with Emma as maid of honor, and James's construction crew serving as groomsmen. Victoria wore a simple white dress she had chosen herself, not because it photographed well or impressed others, but because it made her feel beautiful and free. The transformation in Victoria's life accelerated after the wedding. James sold his apartment and moved into the space above the bakery, immediately beginning renovations to make it a proper home. Together, They expanded Sweet Dreams into the adjacent building, creating a full restaurant that became the heart of their neighborhood. Victoria's desserts were paired with James's practical wisdom and genuine care for their community, creating something neither could have built alone. But the greatest surprise came several months into their marriage, during what should have been a routine morning at the restaurant. Victoria had been feeling unusually tired, attributing it to the long hours they had been working to establish their expanded business. When she nearly fainted while decorating a birthday cake, Emma immediately drove her to Dr. Harrison's office. "Congratulations, Mrs. Collins," Dr. Harrison said, his kind eyes twinkling as he delivered news that would change everything. "You're pregnant." Victoria stared at him in shock. "Pregnant? But how? I mean, I know how, but—" Dr. Harrison chuckled softly. "Sometimes when we stop forcing things and allow our bodies to heal from stress, miracles happen. Your hormone levels indicate you're about 8 weeks along, and everything looks perfectly healthy." The drive back to Sweet Dreams passed in a blur of joy and disbelief. Victoria had given up hope of ever becoming a mother, accepting that chapter of her dreams as closed forever. Now, suddenly, impossibly, new life was growing inside her. James's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen while tears of joy streamed down both their faces. This was what love looked like. Celebration without conditions, joy without demands, acceptance of whatever gifts life chose to offer. The pregnancy progressed beautifully, but it held one more surprise that would make Victoria's story legendary in their small city. During her routine ultrasound, Dr. Harrison's expression shifted from professional calm to amazed excitement. "Victoria, James," he said, adjusting the monitor screen so they could see more clearly. "I hope you're ready for an adventure. You're having triplets." The news hit them like lightning. 3 babies. 3 perfect, healthy babies growing inside the woman Marcus had dismissed as defective. Victoria laughed until she cried, overwhelmed by the divine justice of it all. The universe seemed to be making a statement, writing a story so powerful that no one could deny its meaning. Word of Victoria's pregnancy spread through their community like wildfire, but the reaction was pure celebration. Customers at Sweet Dreams brought baby clothes and offered advice. James's construction crew immediately began transforming the upstairs apartment into a nursery fit for 3. Emma organized baby showers and managed the restaurant when Victoria needed to rest. But the news traveled beyond their supportive community. In the wealthy circles where Marcus moved, whispers began to circulate. The woman he had divorced for being barren was not only pregnant, she was expecting triplets. The irony was too delicious for gossip to ignore. Marcus learned about Victoria's pregnancy through his mother, who had heard it from a friend at the country club. Patricia burst into his office at Westfield Industries, her face flushed with indignation and something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Is it true?" she demanded without preamble. "Is Victoria pregnant?" Marcus looked up from his computer, irritation flashing across his face. "How would I know anything about Victoria's life? We've been divorced for over a year. She's having triplets, Marcus. Triplets." Patricia's voice carried a note of hysteria that made Marcus's stomach clench. "The whole city is talking about it. People are saying what?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "They're saying maybe the problem was never with her. They're questioning everything about your divorce, everything about why you really left her." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had built his entire narrative around Victoria's inadequacy, had used her supposed infertility as justification for abandoning a woman who had loved him unconditionally. Now that foundation was crumbling, and everyone was watching. "It's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She couldn't get pregnant for 5 years with me." "Oh, but she got pregnant immediately with him," Patricia replied, her tone sharp with accusation. "What does that tell you?" The question hung in the air between them, poisonous and undeniable. Marcus had refused to be tested during his marriage to Victoria, had dismissed her suggestions with arrogant certainty. Now, faced with irrefutable evidence of her fertility, he was forced to confront possibilities he had spent years denying. "I'm getting married to Isabella next month," Marcus said finally, grasping for something solid in his shifting world. "She'll give me children. Real children." But even as he spoke the words, Doubt crept into his voice. Isabella had been trying to conceive for months without success, a fact that had begun to worry them both. She had suggested they both undergo testing, but Marcus had refused, just as he had with Victoria. "You need to get tested," Patricia said bluntly, "before this wedding, before you humiliate our family any further." The conversation ended with Marcus's angry dismissal of his mother's concerns, but her words haunted him through the sleepless nights that followed. Victoria's pregnancy had shifted something fundamental in the story he had told himself about their marriage. For the first time, he was forced to consider that he might have been wrong about everything. Meanwhile, Victoria bloomed with her pregnancy, radiant with the joy of impending motherhood and the security of James's unwavering love. Sweet Dreams had become more than a restaurant. It was a symbol of resilience, of second chances, of dreams reborn from ashes. The contrast between Victoria's rising happiness and Marcus's growing anxiety was lost on no one who knew their story. Justice, it seemed, had its own timeline, and Victoria's moment was approaching with the inevitability of sunrise. The birth of Victoria's triplets became the most talked-about event in the city's recent memory. On a crisp autumn morning, 3 healthy boys entered the world within minutes of each other, each one perfect and beautiful beyond description. Victoria held them for the first time in the hospital room, tears streaming down her face as she marveled at the miracle she had never believed possible. James stood beside her hospital bed, his eyes wet with emotion as he gazed at the 3 tiny faces. "They're incredible," he whispered, gently touching each small hand. "Look at them, Victoria. They're absolutely perfect." The boys were indeed remarkable. The eldest by 3 minutes had James's gentle eyes, while the middle child possessed Victoria's determined chin. The youngest seemed to carry the best features of both parents, with an alert expression that suggested he would be the leader of the trio. "What are we going to name them?" Victoria asked, exhaustion and joy warring in her voice. James smiled, having already given this considerable thought. "What about David, Daniel, and Dominic? Strong names for strong boys who were going to change the world." The names felt perfect, carrying weight and promise for the futures these children would create. David, Daniel, and Dominic Collins. 3 boys who would grow up knowing they were wanted, cherished, and celebrated from their very first breath. News of the triplets' arrival spread through the community like celebration itself. Sweet Dreams was flooded with flowers, gifts, and well-wishers who wanted to congratulate the couple everyone had come to love. Emma managed the restaurant while Victoria recovered, ensuring that the business continued to thrive, even as its heart focused on new motherhood. But the news traveled far beyond their supportive neighborhood. In the exclusive circles where Marcus moved, the birth announcement landed like a bombshell. 3 healthy boys born to the woman he had discarded as defective. The mathematical impossibility of coincidence was lost on no one. Marcus learned about the births while reviewing quarterly reports in his office. His secretary, unaware of the personal significance, had mentioned it as local gossip. That sweet couple who owns Sweet Dreams just had triplets. Can you imagine? 3 boys at once. The whole city is celebrating. The pen in Marcus's hand snapped under the pressure of his grip. 3 boys. The sons he had always claimed to want, born to the woman he had abandoned for her supposed inability to provide them. The irony was so complete, so devastating, that it felt like cosmic punishment. Meanwhile, Isabella had been growing increasingly concerned about their own fertility struggles. Despite months of trying, she remained childless, a fact that was beginning to strain their relationship in ways that felt sickeningly familiar. "Marcus, we need to see a specialist," Isabella said one evening over dinner at their favorite restaurant. "Something isn't right. We've been trying for almost a year." Marcus's jaw tightened. "There's nothing wrong with us. These things take time." "Your ex-wife just had triplets," Isabella replied, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "People are talking, Marcus. They're saying maybe the problem in your first marriage wasn't what everyone thought." The conversation that followed was explosive. Isabella demanded answers, testing, accountability, all the things Victoria had once requested and been denied. But unlike Victoria, Isabella was not willing to shoulder blame that might not belong to her. "I'm making an appointment for both of us," Isabella declared, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor of their penthouse. "If you refuse to go, this engagement is over." The ultimatum hung between them like a sword. Marcus found himself trapped by his own arrogance, forced to choose between his pride and his future. The specter of Victoria's triplets haunted every moment of his deliberation. As autumn turned to winter, Victoria settled into motherhood, with a grace that amazed everyone who knew her. The triplets thrived under her loving care, growing stronger and more beautiful each day. James proved to be an extraordinary father, approaching parenthood with the same dedication and gentleness he brought to everything else. Sweet Dreams evolved again to accommodate their growing family. The restaurant became child-friendly during certain hours, with high chairs and changing stations that welcomed other parents in the community. Victoria would often be seen nursing one baby while directing kitchen operations, her multitasking abilities legendary among staff and customers alike. The financial success that followed was beyond anything Victoria had imagined during her darkest days. Sweet Dreams expanded again, opening a second location across town. James's construction company landed major contracts, his reputation for integrity and quality work spreading throughout the region. But perhaps most importantly, Victoria had found peace. The woman who had once believed herself broken was now whole, surrounded by love and living proof that she had never been the problem. Her boys became the center of a community that celebrated their every milestone, their first smiles documented by dozens of phones, their first steps cheered by an entire neighborhood. The contrast between Victoria's rising fortune and Marcus's growing desperation became impossible to ignore. While she built a family and business empire based on love and community, he watched his carefully constructed life begin to crumble under the weight of long-denied truths. Isabella had scheduled the fertility consultation for the week before their wedding, a detail that seemed to mock Marcus's predicament. The appointment loomed like a judgment day, threatening to expose secrets he had spent years protecting. The night before the medical evaluation, Marcus stood in his empty penthouse, staring out at the city lights and thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. Somewhere across town, Victoria was probably tucking 3 beautiful boys into their cribs, singing lullabies in the voice he had once cherished and then dismissed. For the first time since their divorce, Marcus allowed himself to wonder what his life might have looked like if he had chosen love over pride, truth over assumption, partnership over control. The possibilities were too painful to contemplate for long, but they lingered in his mind, like ghosts of better versions of himself. The medical appointment would come tomorrow, bringing answers he was no longer sure he wanted to hear. But tonight, in the silence of his luxurious prison, Marcus finally understood that some mistakes could not be undone, and some losses could never be recovered. Victoria's triplets had become living proof that sometimes the universe writes its own justice, one perfect baby at a time. The fertility clinic's waiting room felt like a courtroom where Marcus was about to face judgment for crimes he had spent years denying. Isabella sat beside him, her designer purse clutched tightly in her manicured hands, her usual confidence replaced by grim determination. The appointment that would determine their future had arrived with the inevitability of a tidal wave. Dr. Mitchell, the city's most respected fertility specialist, delivered the results with clinical precision that left no room for interpretation or denial. The comprehensive tests had taken weeks to complete, examining every possible factor that could affect conception. "Mr. Peterson," Dr. Mitchell said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the extensive file, "I'm afraid the results are quite clear. You have severe oligospermia combined with poor motility. Your sperm count is critically low, and what sperm are present have significant mobility issues. This condition has likely existed for years, possibly stemming from an untreated infection in your youth." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Each medical term was another nail in the coffin of the lies he had built his life upon. Isabella's sharp intake of breath beside him confirmed that she understood the implications immediately. "What does that mean exactly?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the devastating answer. "It means the probability of natural conception is extremely low, nearly impossible, in fact. If fertility was an issue in your previous marriage, I can say with medical certainty that the problem was not with your former wife." Isabella stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like grinding bones. "So you lied to me," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "Everything you told me about your ex-wife, about why your marriage failed, all lies." Marcus tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away as if his touch burned. "Isabella, I didn't know. I thought..." You didn't think. She cut him off, her voice rising to a level that made other patients in the clinic turn to stare. You assumed. You blamed an innocent woman and destroyed her life based on your arrogant assumptions. The public nature of Isabella's outburst added another layer of humiliation to Marcus's rapidly crumbling world. The other couples in the waiting room watched with the fascination of witnesses to a spectacular accident. This was exactly the kind of scene Marcus had spent his life avoiding, and now he was trapped in the center of it. "We can work through this," Marcus pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "There are treatments, procedures." Isabella's laugh was bitter and cutting. "Work through this? Marcus, you spent 5 years torturing a woman who loved you, convinced her she was defective, threw her out like garbage, and now I find out it was you all along. What kind of man does that?" The question hung in the air, like an accusation from a higher court. Marcus had no answer, because there was no acceptable answer. The man who did such things was exactly the man he had always been: proud, controlling, unwilling to admit weakness or fault. "I want nothing to do with you," Isabella continued, removing the engagement ring that had cost Marcus more than most people made in a year. She placed it on the reception desk with a click that sounded like a gavel. "Find someone else to blame for your problems." Isabella's exit from the clinic was dramatic and final, leaving Marcus alone with the wreckage of his carefully constructed life. Dr. Mitchell cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could disappear from this personal disaster. "Mr. Peterson, if you'd like to discuss treatment options—" "No," Marcus said flatly, standing to leave. "There's nothing more to discuss." The drive home passed in a haze of rage and self-pity. Marcus's mind raced through the implications of what he had learned. Not only was he the one with fertility issues, but Victoria's recent pregnancy with triplets had announced this truth to the entire city. Everyone who knew their story would now understand that he had been wrong about everything. The humiliation was complete and public. His business associates, his social circle, his family, they would all know that Marcus Peterson, the man who had always projected perfection and control, was fundamentally flawed in the most basic biological sense. But as the initial shock wore off, a different emotion began to take its place. Not remorse or regret, but anger. Victoria's happiness, her perfect new family, her success, it all felt like a personal insult to Marcus's suffering. The logical part of his mind knew that she deserved every good thing that had happened to her, but logic had never been Marcus's strong suit when his ego was threatened. Over the following days, as news of Isabella's dramatic departure spread through their social circles, Marcus retreated into his penthouse like a wounded animal. The wedding invitations had already been sent, the venue booked, the catering arranged. Canceling everything would be another public admission of failure, another layer of humiliation piled onto his already staggering burden. It was during one of these dark nights that Marcus conceived a plan that would have horrified any decent person. If he was going to be humiliated, if his life was going to become a cautionary tale, then he would ensure that Victoria shared in his downfall. She might have her perfect little family, but she was still the woman who had been discarded, still someone people would see as his leftover. Marcus began reaching out to eligible women in his extended social circle, women who might be impressed by his wealth and status enough to overlook his recent scandals. He found Alexandra, a recent divorcee from the neighboring city who had heard rumors about his situation, but was desperate enough for financial security to ignore them. The courtship was swift and calculated. Alexandra was beautiful enough to photograph well, sophisticated enough to handle the social pressures, and grateful enough for Marcus's attention to agree to a quick marriage. Within weeks, Marcus had convinced her that Victoria had been a gold digger who had trapped him in a loveless marriage, and that his fertility issues were a recent development unrelated to his first divorce. The new wedding was planned with military precision and maximum visibility. Marcus wanted every person who had whispered about his failures to see him rising again, to witness his ability to move forward despite the setbacks. But more than that, he wanted Victoria to see it. "I want to invite some people from my past," Marcus told Alexandra as they reviewed the guest list, "to show them that I've moved beyond old disappointments." Alexandra, eager to please her wealthy new fiancé, agreed without question. She had no idea that she was being used as a weapon in a war that had already claimed too many casualties. Marcus personally wrote Victoria's invitation, crafting each word to maximize the psychological impact. He didn't know about her current success, didn't know about the triplets, didn't know that she had built a life more beautiful than anything he could imagine. In his mind, she was still the broken woman who had left his house with a single suitcase. The invitation was delivered to Sweet Dreams Confectionery on a quiet Tuesday morning. Marcus had made sure it would arrive when the restaurant was busy, hoping to cause maximum embarrassment among Victoria's customers. He imagined her receiving the elegant card with shaking hands, remembering all the ways she had failed him, understanding that he had found happiness while she remained stuck in her small, limited world. But Marcus's imagination was about to collide with a reality far more powerful than anything his wounded ego could have conceived. Victoria's life had become something beyond his ability to understand or control, and the invitation he meant as a final insult was about to become the catalyst for his complete and utter downfall. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not just the truth about their marriage, but the true character of everyone involved. Marcus thought he was orchestrating his redemption, but he was actually arranging his own public destruction. In his penthouse that night, Marcus smiled as he imagined Victoria's reaction to his invitation. He had no idea that across the city the woman he had tried to break was about to demonstrate just how completely he had underestimated her strength, her worth, and her capacity for quiet, devastating justice. The wedding was still weeks away, but the seeds of Marcus's humiliation had already been planted. They would bloom in ways he never could have imagined, watered by his own arrogance, and fertilized by the truth he had spent so many years trying to bury. The morning of Marcus's wedding to Alexandra dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed to promise either triumph or catastrophe. The grand ballroom at Riverside Manor had been transformed into a showcase of extravagant wealth, with thousands of white roses, crystal chandeliers, and enough gold accents to rival a palace. Marcus had spared no expense in creating what he called the wedding of the century, though those who knew the full story understood it was really an elaborate attempt at public rehabilitation. Victoria received the invitation exactly as Marcus had planned. During the busy lunch rush at Sweet Dreams Confectionery, Emma had been the one to sign for the elegant envelope, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the return address. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of passive aggression, written on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing that screamed expensive desperation. "The honor of your presence is requested at the wedding of Marcus Peterson and Alexandra Whitmore," Victoria read aloud, her voice steady despite the obvious intention to wound. Front row seating, reserved for special guests from the groom's past. The calculated cruelty of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. Marcus clearly expected Victoria to either decline in shame or attend as a broken reminder of his supposed upgrade. What he didn't know was that the woman reading his invitation bore no resemblance to the person he had discarded years earlier. James, now Victoria's husband and the father of her children, wrapped his arms around her from behind as she finished reading. "What do you want to do?" he asked gently, though his protective instincts were clearly engaged. Victoria looked around at the thriving restaurant they had built together, at the framed photos of their 3 beautiful sons displayed proudly on the walls, at the community of people who loved and respected her for who she had become. Then she smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, but everything to celebrate. "We're going," she said simply. It's time Marcus learned the truth about consequences. The preparations for Victoria's appearance at the wedding were conducted with military precision, though not for the reasons Marcus might have expected. This wasn't about revenge or showing off. It was about dignity, truth, and the quiet power of a life lived authentically. Victoria chose her outfit carefully, an elegant yellow dress that radiated warmth and confidence, paired with jewelry that spoke of success earned rather than given. James selected a tailored suit that complemented her perfectly, while their 3 boys, now healthy toddlers with bright eyes and infectious smiles, were dressed in matching yellow outfits that made them look like tiny ambassadors of joy. The black Rolls-Royce was James's idea, borrowed from a construction client who insisted on contributing to what he called the most important entrance in the city's history. The vehicle was pristine and powerful, a rolling statement that Victoria Collins was no longer anyone's victim. Meanwhile, at Riverside Manor, Marcus was experiencing what could only be described as pre-wedding panic. Alexandra looked stunning in her designer gown, But Marcus found himself scanning the crowd of arriving guests with the anxiety of someone expecting an attack from an unknown direction. He had convinced himself that Victoria would either not come at all, or would arrive looking appropriately diminished and apologetic. "You seem nervous," Alexandra observed, adjusting Marcus's boutonniere with practiced precision. "Having second thoughts?" Marcus forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just excited to start our new life together," he lied, though his attention remained fixed on the entrance where guests continued to arrive in their formal attire. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock, and by 2:50, Marcus had begun to relax slightly. Perhaps Victoria wouldn't come after all. Perhaps she had recognized the invitation for what it was, a demonstration of his superiority and her irrelevance. Perhaps he would get through this day without having to confront the uncomfortable reminders of his past mistakes. It was at exactly 2:58 that the sound of a luxury vehicle's engine created a subtle shift in the atmosphere outside the manor. Conversations paused mid-sentence as guests turned toward the entrance, curiosity overriding etiquette as they tried to identify the source of the disturbance. The black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the red carpet with the smooth precision of a perfectly choreographed performance. The uniformed driver stepped out and moved to open the rear door, his movements deliberate and respectful. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing happened. Then Victoria emerged. She stepped out of the vehicle like royalty greeting her subjects, her yellow dress catching the afternoon sunlight and transforming it into something almost ethereal. Her posture spoke of confidence earned through trial. Her smile carried the warmth of someone who had found genuine happiness, and her presence commanded attention in ways that money could never purchase. But it was what happened next that would be remembered and discussed for decades to come. Victoria turned back to the car and gently helped 3 beautiful boys step onto the red carpet. David, Daniel, and Dominic Collins, each one perfect, healthy, and undeniably real, took their mother's hands and walked beside her with the natural grace of children who had never doubted their place in the world. The effect on the assembled crowd was electric. Gasps echoed across the venue as the mathematical impossibility of Marcus's narrative crumbled before everyone's eyes. This was the woman he had called barren, walking in triumph with not 1 child, but 3. This was the wife he had discarded as defective, radiating the unmistakable glow of someone who had been vindicated by life itself. Inside the ballroom, Marcus felt the change before he saw its cause. The energy shifted, conversations stopped, and heads turned toward the entrance with the synchronized precision of a choreographed dance. When he followed their gaze and saw Victoria walking toward him with her sons, the blood drained from his face so completely that Alexandra actually reached out to steady him. "Marcus," Alexandra whispered, confusion evident in her voice. "Who is that woman? And those children?" Marcus couldn't answer because there were no words for what he was witnessing. The woman he had blamed, shamed, and abandoned was walking toward him as living proof of his own failures. Every assumption he had made, every cruel word he had spoken, every justification he had constructed for his behavior, all of it was being demolished by the simple act of Victoria's existence. Victoria approached the front row seats that Marcus had so thoughtfully reserved for her, her sons walking beside her with the confidence of children who knew they were loved and wanted. She settled into her seat with the grace of someone attending a performance she found mildly interesting, her presence transforming the entire dynamic of the ceremony. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the crowd like wildfire. "Those are her children? But Marcus said she couldn't have babies." 3 boys, triplets, and look how healthy they are. Didn't he divorce her because she was infertile? So what does that say about? The questions hung in the air, unfinished but unmistakable in their implications. Marcus stood frozen at the altar, watching his carefully constructed reputation dissolve in real time. Alexandra looked between her groom and the woman who had just shattered every story he had told her about his past. "Marcus," Alexandra said quietly, her voice carrying to the front rows through the venue's excellent acoustics. "You told me she couldn't have children. You said that's why your marriage failed." The moment stretched like taffy, everyone waiting to see how Marcus would respond to having his lies exposed so publicly and completely. Victoria simply sat in her reserved seat, her boys quietly coloring in books that James had thoughtfully provided, completely at peace with the chaos her mere presence had created. Finally, Marcus found his voice. though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I thought, you didn't think, Victoria said gently, speaking for the first time since entering the ballroom. Her voice carried clearly through the silence, warm and free of malice. You assumed. You blamed. You never bothered to learn the truth. Alexandra stepped back from the altar, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves. So it was you, she said, the pieces finally clicking into place. You were the one with the fertility problems. You destroyed an innocent woman's reputation to protect your own ego. The public nature of the revelation made it impossible to deny or spin. 300 of the city's most influential people had just witnessed Marcus's complete moral bankruptcy, exposed by the simple act of Victoria's attendance. She hadn't said anything cruel, hadn't sought revenge, hadn't even raised her voice. She had simply existed, authentically and completely, and let the truth speak for itself. I can't marry you, Alexandra announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. I won't be part of this pattern of cruelty and deception. As Alexandra gathered her skirts and walked away from the altar, Marcus was left standing alone in front of 300 guests, exposed and abandoned in the most public way possible. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft voices of Victoria's sons asking if they could have more crackers. Victoria stood then, gathering her boys with the practiced efficiency of an experienced mother. She had no need to say anything more. Her presence had accomplished everything necessary. As she prepared to leave, she paused and looked back at Marcus with something that might have been pity. I forgive you, Marcus, she said softly. I hope someday you find the peace that comes with accepting truth instead of hiding from it. And then she was gone, walking back to her Rolls-Royce with her 3 perfect sons, leaving behind a ballroom full of stunned guests and one utterly defeated man who finally understood the price of pride. Years later, people would still talk about the day Victoria Collins attended her ex-husband's wedding and brought justice with her in the form of 3 beautiful boys and the quiet dignity of a woman who had survived the worst and emerged stronger. It became a story about redemption, about the danger of assumptions, about the power of truth to eventually surface no matter how deeply it's buried. Victoria went on to expand Sweet Dreams into a chain of restaurants that employed hundreds and fed thousands. Her boys grew up surrounded by love, community, and the knowledge that their mother was a woman of extraordinary strength. James continued his work building homes for families in need, inspired daily by the resilience of the woman he was privileged to call his wife. Marcus never remarried. He spent his remaining years alone with his pride and his mistakes, finally understanding that some prices are too high to pay and some losses too complete to survive. But Victoria's story became something beautiful, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply to live well, love deeply, and let life itself provide the justice that courts could never deliver.